Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our EHS Daily Advisor webinar, Simplifying Industrial Hygiene for Safety Pros and the Workforce, sponsored by our friends from Intelex and Avetta. My name is Michelle from the EHS Daily Advisor, and I'm here to cover some housekeeping items before passing today's session over to our guest speaker. So a couple of notes. The console that you're looking at right now does have a few different application widgets that you can use, and you can feel free to move these around your screen and minimize them or maximize them as you wish. Just to go over a couple of those widgets, there is one called the Media Player button, and this does allow you to play with the volume for today's session. Please do take note, though, that there is no dial-in number for attendees, and the audio is streaming directly from your computer speakers, so please be sure they're turned up and on. If you have any type of technical difficulty during today's session, you can click on the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. This does cover some common technical issues, but if your issue persists, please feel free to enter a question into the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to help you out. And speaking of that Q&A box, we're very excited to hear from you today, and we'll be hosting a live Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So any questions you have on today's session, please go ahead and submit them using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be asking you some questions during today's session. So keep your eyes open for a few polls throughout today's presentation. You can go ahead and submit your poll responses right in the center of your screen in the live view. And we do also have a group chat available to you as well. So this does allow you to chat with each other. You can communicate with us. We'll chat with you back as well. So please go ahead and let us know your name and where you're logging in from today utilizing that group chat. We'd love to see it. Okay, everyone, so to get started, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Rachel Walla, CSP CIH, Safety Consultant at Alley Safety, LLC. If you do wish to learn a little bit more about our guest speaker, Rachel, you can access her full bio in the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen. Thanks so much for being here today. I'll now kick it over to you, Rachel.
Hi, thank you. So I will go ahead and just click to this first slide. So I'm Rachel, and I'm going to be presenting Simplifying Industrial Hygiene for Safety Pros and the Workforce. I can see who the attendee list is here. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to present this information. It's nice to be able to see who's here, see what companies you may be from. So great to have you. It's always a little hard with webinars to keep it interactive, but I'm going to do my best for you. So what I'm going to talk about today has a lot to do with this quote here at the bottom. Now that I know better, I do better. And so all this presentation is about is teaching us how we can do better when it comes to industrial hygiene, both for ourselves as health and safety professionals and also for our employees. So what we're going to cover is we have two main objectives today. We want to simplify by showing the basics of industrial hygiene for safety pros. So if you're a safety pro out there who's not super comfortable with industrial hygiene, this is going to walk you through some of the basics so that you'll feel more comfortable with monitoring and kind of the workflows that you should be going through. If you are comfortable with it, it's going to be a good review. Once we're more confident with what we're doing, we tend to do a lot better at it and do better at communicating to employees. So that is really the foundation that we're going to build. Then we're going to talk about communicating and making industrial hygiene more relatable to employees. This is a topic that can be very dry and seem really foreign to people. And what we want to do is make it something that's accessible and interesting. So we're going to be talking about that in the second half. We're going to be playing some videos, giving some examples. I think overall it's going to be a fun session, so stay tuned. So what I want to do to start out is I want to hear back from you. Now, if you could, in one word, describe your impression of the subject of industrial hygiene. And I encourage you to be honest, whether good, bad, or indifferent. It's really fun to see what people think of it starting out. So go ahead, type that in, submit it. I'll give you just a minute, and then we'll go over some of the responses. Okay. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, Rachel. The responses are actually in the group chat widget, so if you want to pop that open, you'll see them flooding in.
I see the team chat. I don't see any coming in yet.
At the bottom of your screen, do you see group chat versus team chat? It's a separate window.
Got it. Cool.
Yep. Pop that one open.
Thanks everybody for your patience. Okay, cool. So thank you guys for for entering these. This is great. Confusing, got it. Complex, intoxicating, that's a good one. Data, I get that. Yeah, sometimes it just seems like a lot. Health, life, interesting. So those are some good signs for us today. Specific, daunting. All of these are really good. And I've definitely felt them myself at certain times, and the people that I work with have as well. So awesome. Yeah, if anybody else hasn't seen the list, go ahead and scroll through it. There is some awesome adjectives in there. So what we're going to cover in today's session, a little bit more breaking it down, introductions, who I am. So you know who I am to talk about this, you know where the information is coming from, and you know I'm not just a random person on the internet. Our current state and why I think we need to make industrial hygiene more relatable. Then we'll do IH for safety pros, and then we'll talk about simplifying, relating, and communicating. And one thing that I like to say with that is something that we often talk about in science, is that the simplest explanation is often the correct one, and it's often the best. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. So in today's session, we will be simplifying complex ideas to make industrial hygiene relatable. And why? Well, because as some of you said, it is interesting and it's fun. Industrial hygiene, in my opinion, can be very fascinating when you're able to generate that sort of understanding amongst the workforce and see something click. It's very rewarding. And then you can really make progress in terms of reducing risk. So I'm Rachel Walla. I am a certified safety professional and a certified safety professional and a certified industrial hygienist. I've been a safety consultant for quite a while, and I currently work for myself. I've been working for myself for about 3 years at Ally Safety. We do a YouTube channel. We talk a lot about safety. It's all about safety and industrial hygiene where I'm from. So who am I to talk about this? Well, I've been in safety and industrial hygiene for 10 years. I've worked as a consultant both for large Fortune 500 companies and everything down to tiny small businesses. I mostly work out of the Portland, Oregon area, but I've been all over the US for work. I've been in everything from an industrial hygiene tech to a consultant, to a safety manager. And then about 1.5 years ago, I started putting safety videos on YouTube. And that has caused me to drastically pivot my career to where now what I do is I focus on education and videos. So all I'm pretty much doing is videos. It's had a good response. So I think my expertise is broad. I'm more of a IH generalist for sure than a specialist in any one topic. But I've had to communicate this to many different workforces. I've worked with a lot of different safety professionals and different people throughout the organizations. And so that's why I think I'm uniquely suited to talk about this. So at Ally Safety, our whole vision is making safety entertaining. And that's what I'm going to be talking about with you today, is how you can actually make this more engaging, both for yourself and for others. So I like this quote here: an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. So good for you for showing up for webinars. I know we're all very busy, but I'm going to make sure that this time is worthwhile. So moving on to the next section, let's talk just a little bit about what the current state is. So broadly speaking, there are, roughly 650,000 chemical products that currently exist. And of course, hundreds are added every year. The best estimates are saying that about 32 million workers are exposed to potentially dangerous chemicals every single year. And if you look at it, there are only about 15,000 industrial hygienists in the US, about half of which are CIHs. Just to kind of compare that to safety professionals, last I looked, there were about 50,000 safety professionals that had certifications from the Board of Certified Safety Professionals in the United States. So clearly there are a lot of safety professionals who aren't going for more of the IH designation. And with how many chemical and other IH concerns we have in the workforce now, we really need more of that expertise. So when it comes to industrial hygiene expertise, there's this quote that I like from Albert Einstein that any fool can know, but the point is to really understand. And so I'm not saying that anybody is a fool, but the point is we have a lot of data available at our fingertips. And we work so quickly and work through so many problems now that often we don't get time to like deeply understand a subject. But we need to understand it well so that we can spread that understanding to the workforce. And so we want to be able to make that switch between understanding a chemical, say at just the permissible exposure limit, and understand how it actually works. Now, as an example, I'm going to show you some industrial hygiene fatality data. So what this chart shows is how many people in the US workforce died of a single inhalation issue from 2011 to 2017. Now, 37% occurred in a confined space, so that's quite a few. All fatal single inhalations of methane gas involved a confined space. Other chemicals that led to fatal injury after a single inhalation that were not confined spaces, they also had toluene, solvents, degreasers, dichloromethane, a couple other different things mixed in there. But what I want to show you is like these numbers are actually pretty small. In no way am I saying this is okay, but just to give you some context, that's acute exposures, and these are chronic exposures, which are a much bigger deal, and they're harder to track over a long career. So, you know, we start with chronic exposures. The number one thing is ergonomic issues. This falls under the IH umbrella. Overexertions, cumulative trauma disorders, all of those add up to be the number one cause of workplace injuries in the United States. Asbestos still kills about 12,000 to 15,000 people in the US every year. Now, what that's based on is asbestos takes a long time to actually see the effects of an exposure. And usually these are exposures that happened quite a few years ago before we had all our safety protocols. But as you can see, it still is impacting a large population. Now, when it comes to lead, another common one, approximately 94% of adults with elevated blood lead levels are exposed in the workplace. So that shows you that the biggest problem for adults is definitely occupational. Now, hearing loss. 24% of hearing difficulty in the US is caused by occupational exposures. I personally think that's probably a bit low, but that's where we are right now. It's estimated that about 30 million adults in the US have hearing loss in both ears. So just to give that a sense of scale, the US population, I think, is around 330 million. So silicosis, that's still responsible for 100 deaths per year. And carbon monoxide is about 600 deaths annually. That's both occupational and non-occupational. So that would be more of an acute exposure, but I wanted to put that in here just to show there are a lot of issues when it comes to these types of things. A lot of them occur over time. And I just want to be able to say, okay, here's why we have an issue that we need to get more knowledgeable about. The next part that is always surprising to me is when I go out and talk to employees. Risk tolerance is a zoo when it comes to these topics. Now, I'm not saying it's not in other traditional safety topics, because it is there as well. But there's such a spectrum of employee views when it comes to exposures that range from complacency, and that won't hurt you, to fear, distrust, and even paranoia of employers. So as an example, at one point I was doing sampling on a large job site where I did not allow a chemical to come on site. They were having me approve their SDSs, and I didn't allow a chemical to come on site because it was a reproductive toxin. And the response from the employees was, well, we've already had all the kids we want to have. We don't care. And then on the other side of this facility, I was doing mold and asbestos air sampling for people in a lab where there was no asbestos because people were so concerned that there could potentially be asbestos that was in the HVAC system. So, you have really, really far apart in the same workforce of people who are thinking, they're okay with massive risks and people that are okay with next to no risk. But what we do know is that the perceptions of employees are changing. So when employees believe that their employer cares about their health and well-being, they are 38% more engaged. They're 17% more likely to still be working there in 1 year. 18% are more likely to go above and beyond for their organization, and 28% are more likely to recommend them their workplace, which is so critical right now when we have so many labor shortages. So the reality of all this is physical hazards are easier to protect against than most IH concerns. And one reason I love this illustration here is how many of you zoomed in to the woman on the roof? And it's just an illustration, but we're just so attuned to being able to see hazards in front of our eyes. The difficult thing is when they're invisible hazards. It's really hard for us to see them and take them seriously. And we really need to shift our thinking around there. And to do that, we really need a more informed and engaged workforce. Okay. So how can we make industrial hygiene relatable across such a varied audience? Now, what I want to do here is show you a quick video. This is an excerpt from an Introduction to HAZCOM video I did about a year ago. And what we focused on doing is start somewhere relatable. Start somewhere where everybody can kind of identify with what you're saying. If they're not personally involved, they probably know somebody who's like that. Remember to talk about the why and give real life examples. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and play this quick video just to give you an example. So let's go.
Have you ever been eating junk food and you start to get suspicious that it's just a little bit too good to be natural? So you start looking at the ingredients on the package, and slowly you start to comprehend that nothing in this package has come in contact with nature. Except for maybe corn, and that was like 3 processing facilities ago. So you start Googling the ingredients, and pretty soon you're an expert on things you can't even pronounce. Most of us as consumers are getting much more discerning about what we eat. But eating is only one of the ways that we can get exposed to hazardous substances. There's also inhalation. Inhalation is how we get exposed to things like asbestos, silica, and of course now coronavirus. There's also absorption through the skin, which a lot of people tend to forget about. But remember, if you can get a dose of nicotine through the skin, or birth control, or vitamins, it's just as likely that you can get a toxic exposure through your skin. Or injection. Injection happens when we get exposed to a hazardous substance through a break or a cut in the skin, or when a hazardous or sharp object breaks the skin's barrier and we get exposed to whatever was on that object. A classic example of this is needle sticks in medical facilities. And lastly, back to ingestion. Chances are, if you're eating lunch in a contaminated workplace or with dirty hands, you are most likely ingesting some of whatever it is that you work with.
Okay, so that's an example. Now, when it comes to this sort of change that we want to see in terms of people understanding what they're exposed to, we want to start with ourselves. As the safety pros, we are the subject matter experts. It's great if we can expand that to a larger group and spread it through the organization, but it really starts with us. And the goal is to encourage and empower the workforce to take an active role in both safety and health. So I'm curious about you guys. What types of IH concerns do you have in your workplace? Like, are you thinking about noise, radiation, what particular chemicals? Go ahead and fill it in the group chat so I can see, and then I'll be able to tailor the rest of this presentation a little bit more to you. Okay, lead, paint booths, isocyanates, noise, ergonomics. Cool, we have a really good mix here. Fumes from welding, that's a good one to talk about. Air qualities, musculoskeletal. Interesting, okay. COVID, oh, I know so many people who have just had it with COVID this year, it's a lot. Okay, drinking water, coolant and oils. Yeah, I've dealt with that one quite a bit. So interesting. Spice dust, okay. Indoor air quality, we'll touch on that. Cool. Great to see this list. Okay, so we will continue from here. Now, under the IH umbrella, as you guys probably know, it's a huge subject. I just took the CIH about a year ago, and I was just reminded how broad it is. It's so broad. So what we're going to kind of look at here, this isn't all inclusive, but just in case you didn't know, IH covers ergonomic issues, radiation, thermal stresses, noise and vibration, chemical exposures, and of course, indoor air quality, like those mold issues that you sometimes see. Now, when you start with industrial hygiene, there is an actual workflow that is set up in place. It's called AREC. And so it used to be AREC. They've added a C, and then I put another C in parentheses here because communication is so important, and that's a big topic that we're talking about today. So first, anticipate what might be the potential hazards, recognize, which is when you identify the hazards, evaluate, where you assess them, and control them, where you would create effective controls. Since the last couple years, they've added another C, which is for confirm, which is how you validate that the controls work, and then communicate. So this is the whole work process. If you can kind of get this down, this is going to help you to sample. This is going to help you to understand how your workflows need to go when it comes to IH, and it just simplifies the whole process. Now, you probably already are very familiar with this workflow because it looks really similar to another one. It's as simple as plan, do, check, act. True, it's just a little bit different. Anticipate, recognize, evaluate, control, confirm, and then I put in communicate. But it's basically the same thing. So remember, plan, do, check, act. It's just a continuous cycle. So step one is anticipate. Now, if this quote from Abraham Lincoln, I think, is applicable to chopping down a tree, and it's also applicable to industrial hygiene. So he said, if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. Now, there's a common workplace thing they say where you're too busy sawing to stop and sharpen the saw. And as a safety and health professional, I know how busy we all are and that we don't have time for a lot of things that we would like to have time for. But you have to reinvest in yourself, and taking time to educate yourself is crucial to your success, especially when it comes to industrial hygiene. So if you're going to anticipate the hazards correctly and accurately, you need to make sure that you're taking time to educate yourself. Now, for resources on this, obviously you're on this webinar, so you understand some of the resources. But I would also say there's a ton of resources out there. So take advantage of learning from experts. Participate in Q&A sessions, network. LinkedIn is great. I network on LinkedIn all the time. I text other industrial hygienists. I work with a lot of different safety people. It's super important in just staying up on things. And then great webinar resources are ACGIH, ASSP, vendors, your insurance company. I do a couple webinars a year usually for different insurance companies. So I know that they're providing quite a few free resources for their customers. Then of course, OSHA, EPA, those different organizations as well. Now, when you're starting down the research path, I want you to be aware of these reference points if you aren't already. This will be old news to some of you, but if it's news to you, it's going to be key in helping you out. So remember the NIOSH Pocket Guide. That is the best starting out point when you're researching different industrial hygiene questions. Review OSHA's permissible exposure limit, like in the table Z1, that's a good place to start, or whatever OSHA standard is applicable. And then review the approved sampling methods for that substance. So and somebody also said, don't forget AIHA for webinars. So don't forget that. That's a good point. Thank you. And so always review the sampling methods so that you're doing it correctly to get the most accurate results. So references continued. If you don't have reference books, buy a couple. These are my two favorites. So Fundamentals of Industrial Hygiene. It's about a $250 book. So if your company won't buy the most recent version for you, you can get an old version like I have back here for about $20, and they're slightly different, but there's not huge differences. And then this industrial hygiene reference and study guide is really key to just understanding a simplified amount of the concepts. And they have all these amazing one-liners that help to really simplify some of the more complicated subjects. So definitely check those out. So that was A, anticipate. Now recognize. Start with smaller hazards like ergonomics, noise, and single contaminants. You don't really want to dive in too deep to really complex subjects when you're just starting out. Once you can work with industrial hygienists, other safety pros who are more knowledgeable than you. If you want to hire an industrial hygienist and come and tag along with them, just let them know initially that that's what you're doing. I have lots of clients who want to do that. That's absolutely fine. But just make sure you have a good understanding, and then you can start putting your leadership to use and actually making some changes here. So once you've anticipated, you need to recognize what the hazards are. So what's always the best next step is decide what substances or processes need to be monitored. So, I'll go in and be like, okay, let's do the welding shop. The ones that are at risk are shift A and B. You can decide noise monitoring, how often you're going to do that. And then maybe you're going to do a quarterly isocyanate sampling. Go in and make a sampling plan and kind of start from there. You don't want to just run at it with all your resources and make it happen. Create a plan that's sustainable where you can keep up with it. And then next, evaluate. This quote by Peter Drucker kind of explains it all. What gets measured is what gets managed. So if you can quantify what your hazards are, you can usually much easier justify the changes that need to be made. So just a quick check-in for where we are right now. I'm interested to hear, what is your comfort level with industrial hygiene monitoring? Because that'll kind of say how in-depth we go on the next portion. It's not super long, but I do just want to have a quick discussion about a few things that I've helped other safety professionals with that has been useful for them. So I will give you just a moment to respond. This will come up as a poll. So what you'll see is a graph kind of displaying the data. It won't be like the previous chats where your name is associated with it. So just feel free. You don't have to be embarrassed about your answer or, worry about it being tied to you in any way. Okay. I hope everybody's had a chance. I'm about to click forward in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So what is your comfort level with industrial hygiene monitoring? Some very comfortables, great. Somewhat. So some people that are like, ooh, not too certain. Okay, got it. Some neutrals and some uncomfortables. So thank you for showing that. That's actually super helpful to me. So we will keep this kind of broad, and then we'll go forward from there on some of the more interesting stuff about communicating and relating. Okay, so what I would say is if you are in that category where you're very uncomfortable with it, don't start with the most complicated equipment out there. What I would say is there's an app for that. Let's start there. That way you have a free app. You can use it. You can test it out around home. You can test it out at work. It's going to teach you where to start. So for example, with noise, it's really helpful just to be able to look at what the noise levels are around you when you're doing different activities. It'll get you more comfortable with reading decibels and kind of the average limits of different, average levels of different things you're exposed to. Start there. Then the NIOSH Pocket Guide app is awesome. It's a great one to just have that industrial hygiene data at your fingertips. And then the OSHA NIOSH Heat Safety Tool is another fun one to start off with. So start there, get comfortable with the data. And then if you are going to do industrial hygiene monitoring, remember, practice makes perfect. These are not perfect instruments. They are faulty. Things go wrong. The pumps quit working. All of it needs to be calibrated pretty regularly. So what I would say is if you're going to plan out some monitoring, don't expect to jump in immediately. So if you're going to rent the equipment, maybe rent it for a few days before you actually need it, or get a chance to use it on site. Keep some in your office, practice with it, get to know it. Don't just jump right in and expect to do monitoring. You can, but then it's harder to predict how things will go. It's harder to understand when things are malfunctioning. So get familiar with the settings. That's super important. Know what the normal levels are, how to adjust when necessary. And if you have questions, reach out for help, especially if you're renting the equipment. A lot of times there's an excellent tech department that I've been able to reach out to, so you have help, you have resources, and definitely utilize those. Don't leave yourself out in the cold. Now, another thing I want to point out is always be open with employees about the process and let them see how it works too. So if they're wearing a personal monitor for the day, they need to be able to be involved and be informed, and just make sure you're always being open. So for those of you who don't do 8-hour sampling, I'm just going to go over a quick timeline. Usually what it looks like is I'll arrive at the beginning of shift, get inside, get on whatever toolbox talk meeting there is, explain what I'm doing, explain the monitors, talk about who I am so people are comfortable with me. Then I will take copious notes throughout the day, everything like if they were using metalworking fluid, what the actual brand is, what the percentage is, if they're welding, what type of welding, get really in depth on all your notes of what's going on for that day, because you want to understand what is happening in the workplace that may impact your results one way or another. And also so you understand when the next sampling round comes along, if you already have representative sampling or if something in the process has changed and you need to update it. So lunch break, take notes. Once check in with everybody at lunch or before or right after, just to make sure everything's still running. Then usually at the end of the day, you collect your monitors, take notes on the day's activity, and then get everything ready to go to the lab if it is going to the lab. And next, you wait for results. Usually a lot of these that I do, I end up waiting for results from the lab. So collect and interpret results either from instruments themselves or the labs. And then results for a lot of these have to be communicated to employees within 5 business days of the receipt of results for many substances. How we do this a lot is we will have letters, and then we will try to verbally communicate with the employees as well. One thing that we're concerned about here is, I'm sorry, I just got interrupted. So what we want to do here is make sure that we're very clear about the levels, and very clear about what work they were doing, and then talk about, okay, here are the levels. If they are below the permissible exposure limit, explain what that means. If they're above, explain what you're going to do to make adjustments. Now, this can be a situation where you can create some alarm. We don't want to create alarm unless it's necessary, and it's usually not necessary. What we want to do is communicate appropriately. So the purpose of industrial hygiene monitoring is to ensure the workplace is safe. If we have an issue and we find problems, we make adjustments. That's the whole purpose of doing these. Always be open and honest, always talk about it. But it's not like, okay, maybe you were overexposed to a certain type of dust for a little while. A lot of times it's a potential issue, but it's not going to immediately impact their health. If it is a serious issue, make sure you communicate that. But it's more about just like walking them through the results so they have a really clear understanding and being very open about the process. When employers don't communicate, like let's say they don't want me to come back and communicate to employees and I leave the letters there and they never get distributed out, it creates a lot of problems and a lot of suspicion. So just make sure you're very open. And then control. What gets measured gets managed again. So how are we going to control these? Again, it's similar to just any safety process. Use the hierarchy of controls. Obviously, you want to use the most effective ones. So substitution, engineering, administrative, and then down to PPE. Right now, there's so many different products you can substitute. That's such a great place to start because there are more and more options on the market all the time. If you can't do substitution, try engineering like containing, enclosing, all those types of things, and then go down to administrative controls and PPE after that. Definitely don't jump to PPE first. Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch gears into talking about how do you actually communicate that information to employees. So what I'm interested to hear from you is how comfortable do you feel communicating industrial hygiene information to both management and employees. So we'll give you just a minute here. Okay, I'm ready to move on in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so that's great. A lot of you feel very comfortable. Some of you are somewhat comfortable, neutral, and a few uncomfortables in there. Now, let's go forward. So confirm. When we confirm, is this working the way that it should? Now, maybe you have enough controls in place that you're below the permissible exposure limit. It's still good to do periodic sampling. If you're above that action limit, a lot of the OSHA language is going to make you continue to sample. And if you're above the permissible exposure limit, you're going to need to keep sampling until you get levels below the permissible exposure limit. So always remember, things like preventative maintenance can really be helpful in removing contaminants. Stationary monitors are a good way to alert you to issues. You know, when we talk about noise, hearing tests are, of course, a lagging indicator, but those are a good way to also understand how things are working in the real world. A lot of times when you are working with like downdraft booths, paint booths, doing that annual ventilation testing or periodic ventilation testing is super important to understand how your controls are functioning. And then lastly, communication. So a lot of you are comfortable relating IH subjects, so that's awesome. Good to hear. And what we know from history is that poor communication about hazards has led to countless injuries, illnesses, and deaths. So open communication really encourages trust amongst the workforce. And what I see here is when workforces are open, the culture is better. But when it's not open and when people don't know what's going on, there's more paranoia, there's less trust, and there's just a lot more difficulty in people understanding the messages that are sent out because they don't believe in them. So to keep in mind, employees who understand their risks are better able to protect themselves and identify problems when they occur. Now, I said employees here, but don't forget, management has to understand these equally as well. So often we'll deal with management who maybe understands a process really excellently, but they don't really understand chemical exposures as well. And they don't understand the health implications either. So we have to make sure they have the information that they need to make those changes and then to communicate them to their employees. So there are 3 principles that I really think work here: simplify, relate, and communicate. We've all sat through dry scientific lectures where maybe we get some good information out of them, but it's much harder to have that click moment where you understand how things work. We also need to compare to something that we already understand and know why it matters. Now, you know, if you have kids at home, you may be used to teaching kids, maybe you're more comfortable with explaining things to kids. And then a lot of us in our careers, we explain things to adults all the time. Now, one thing that's important to actually go for a minute to articulate is that adults need different things to learn than kids. So as adults, we need to be confident when we start learning because we learn a lot less than kids. Kids are always absorbing new information. So when information is presented to us, we need it to be presented in a way that's a bit more comfortable and a bit more confidence building in order for us to really grasp that information and implement it. We also need to know why it matters. So for adults to change their behaviors, you can tell them what they have to do, but we all hate that. We need to know why we need to do it in order to make those changes. So we're going to focus on some of those issues. Now, one thing that's great to start with your industrial hygiene teaching is if you're talking to an audience about a certain contaminant or a certain issue, you can go with a historical example. Start with a story. We love story time, even as adults. That's a great place to start. And usually big industrial hygiene issues have come about because large populations have been exposed to something dangerous. So a historical example is Libby, Montana. It's the site of one of America's worst man-made environmental disasters. Toxic asbestos dust from vermiculite mines killed hundreds of residents, sickening thousands more, and victims continue to surface. So that's not really a super interesting story, but what we could do is we could follow maybe an individual. We could start with a newspaper article. We could talk about how it impacted people's lives. Kind of an interesting point with that is there was so much asbestos in the asbestos contamination outside the mine that they figured even if you're cutting firewood, so some people have done tests on this, you would still be getting overexposed to asbestos just because it's blown away from outside the mine. So interesting little tidbits like that are always great. Now, in this case, W.R. Grace, the company that owned the mine, knew about it, but didn't warn anyone. So again, the key is communication. Another historical example that's a good one to talk about, white phosphorus. There was literally a time where matchstick workers would be exposed to white phosphorus and it would literally rot out their jaw and teeth. So really horrific things have happened, and we're so lucky that we live in an age where we understand more of this. And lastly, radium. This has been popular. I think a new Radium Girls show came out this year. I haven't seen it, but it's supposed to be kind of focused on the girls who worked in these watch factories. So, you know, anytime you can give some historical context to what you're working with, it really helps people to identify with it, and it helps to provide a story. So the next problem is, why do we have to do things a certain way, and why should we care? So I'm going to continue to play that one clip starting where we left off on the HAZCOM standard. What I did here is I incorporated a little bit of history. So when the HAZCOM program actually was implemented and why people should care about it. So we're going to go ahead and play that just as an example and a demonstration to illustrate this point.
When it comes to hazardous substances in the workplace, we tend to leave that all up to our employer, despite the fact that our own actions have huge implications on our own safety and health. And what's even more interesting is that we as employees only gained the right to know about the hazardous substances in our workplace in the 1980s. Before that, the work world was pretty suspect. You see, in 1983, OSHA implemented the Hazard Communication Standard. This was also known as the Employee Right to Know Act.
But I want to talk to you about how we inspect for compliance with our Hazard Communication Standard for construction. We do that on every inspection now, no matter what, because we want all employers and employees to know the hazards of the chemicals at their work sites.
The point of this act was for employees to be informed about the hazardous substances that they're working with and be protected from those substances.
Most managers and workers don't know as much as they should about the chemicals they work with.
It's also the same standard that gave us things like safety data sheets, or SDSs, and outlined how hazardous materials have to be labeled.
Research hazardous chemicals for yourself. I think you'll agree that minimizing the risk of employee exposure to hazardous chemicals will result in a healthier, more productive workforce.
This was a huge step forward in workplace safety. You can make a huge impact on your health and safety just by taking an active role and looking into what the hazards of these substances actually are.
Okay, so just some examples of how you can incorporate that into your training when you get up to do a PowerPoint, when you get up to do a presentation. Remember, focus on the why. People really need to understand why they should care. So, and then next, make the subject 3D. Now, a lot of the times we're dealing with subjects that are actually really interesting, whether it's IH or traditional safety. You know, these are things that are pretty cool in the science of how they work, or even confined spaces, talking about what you need to do in a confined space. There's a lot of interesting science, a lot of interesting demonstrations that you can do, and they impact our work. So we need to make it 3D. Now, what I'm going to talk about here with these 4 sections is what's called the VARC model of learning. This has been debunked multiple times because they used to say everybody has a way that they learn, they're born with it, and they kind of went to an extreme end with it. So I'm not saying the VARC model is the way to go, But what I am saying is these are a good framework to use when you're planning out your training of what you can implement to help people to really relate to and understand what you're trying to communicate with them. So visual, seeing how it works. You can do demonstrations. I personally love the visual side of it. It makes much more sense to me. Auditory, listening to an explanation is super important for some people. Reading and writing or using reference manuals is a good way. For some of us, if you've ever had to take a lot of notes for a class, we learn better by taking notes. So that can be a good thing. And then kinesthetic, which is physical experience or practicing. With so many safety procedures that are a little bit more involved, we don't truly learn them until we actually have to go through and do them. So that's also a good way to get people used to it, is that on-site sort of demonstrative actual practicing of procedures. So always make sure, especially with industrial hygiene, make it as 3D as you can, make it include all of these different things, because it's going to make it come to life in so much of a more real way. So I'm just curious. Obviously, I am not saying that everybody has a specific learning type that they really understand or go with now, but I would be interested in hearing what you personally prefer. How do you learn the best? What's worked really well for you in your background? And we'll go from there. Okay, I'm going to give it 3, 2, 1. Okay, so visual, 42. Kinesthetic, very interesting. So auditory didn't go too far. I know some of us listen to Audible books, so that's kind of interesting to me. Reading and writing, okay. So, I find this so fascinating, because when you think about the way that we learn things both in school and then at work, a lot of times we're more focusing on PowerPoint presentations when so many more of us are hands-on learners, the kinesthetic type or the visual type. So this is what communicates to us. It creates so much of a more of a message. So, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. A video is worth how many more? Or real life is worth yet even more. So we're going to look a little bit about how we can kind of make this more interesting. So one thing is, you won't always have the ability to show a video or to demonstrate or to get out and actually have people practice something. So when you don't have that ability, how can you bring the words to life? So let's say we're wondering, how does a substance actually work in the body? So, I could stand up here and I could say, asbestos is a tiny fibrous silicate material that can cause lung diseases like cancer. It's like, okay, I can understand that. It's a little bit wordy, and a lot of times you want to communicate the words that are a little bit more simple to understand, but that works. Or you could say coronavirus is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus that can lead to upper respiratory tract infections and other complications. Okay, I kind of understand that. These are both explanations I got off the internet, but it doesn't really get down to how things actually work. So can you give any sort of a visual understanding with maybe some simpler words? And it's not that we need to dumb things down, but what we do need to do is make it simple to start with, and you can get technical later on. So asbestos acts like tiny slivers in your lungs that result in knots of scar tissue. Okay, so can you imagine tiny slivers in your lungs? Can you kind of, even if you don't have a demonstration, can you kind of see that in your mind's eye? That will create a story. It'll create an image that's more memorable than a more technical description. So coronavirus's spiky surface cell proteins kill healthy cells. So those little spikes that we see on all the illustrations are actually important to know about. So, okay, I could kind of see why this could be bad. It's just about creating illustrations through descriptions, even if you can't get to the hands-on part. So, like I said, start with simple explanations and get more technical from there. So let's say I want to describe why asbestos fibers are able to stay airborne for so long, but I need to do it in a way that kind of engages employees. And then let's say the next problem is we need a way to simplify ergonomics. Every time I walk through the warehouse, I see people, you know, in awkward positions or poor lifting, and I want to just have a phrase that we can print on some posters that we can say to each other. Okay, so how are we going to do that? So asbestos, I could say these are tiny fibers. They're less than 1 micrometer in length. Ergonomics, I could say focus on posture and positioning. Neither one of those are bad, but you want to stay away from jargon. Jargon, any technical language that we do not understand. If you can avoid jargon, it's good. So, you know, if you're working with, let's say, carpenters who work in a 1/16 of an inch generally, you say micrometer, and it's like, okay, I have nothing to relate that to. You know, I understand it's really small. I don't understand exactly how small. Or then ergonomics, posture and positioning. Okay, but what position are you, like, can you give me more specifics? What actually looks good in that? So Warren Buffett says bad terminology is the enemy of good thinking. So always think about how you're phrasing things. So find a simple way. Asbestos is hollow like a straw. Okay, we know what hollow things are. Like, it's a little easier to understand why they don't sink so fast. Or ergonomics, rather than saying focus on posture and positioning, focus on neutral positioning. Are you neutral? Are you in a comfortable position? That's a little bit easier for people to grasp onto quickly and easily. So if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you can't understand it yourself. That's one thing that Einstein said that I think is interesting. Now, we're not talking about dumbing a subject down. Obviously, we work with a lot of really intelligent people. We don't need to dumb things down. It's not about that. But it's about us understanding it so well that it becomes simple. So if you feel very comfortable with a subject, you can communicate it more effectively. And we don't need to necessarily throw out technical terms or, you know, 4-syllable words, because it doesn't help us to get there. When I want something explained to me, I want you to explain it like a friend. And that's what I would do for people in the workforce as well. Of course, there are people who latch onto the technical language and really like it, but I'm not going to start there. And I would recommend that you don't either. Start with a more conversational approach. Okay, and then next, keep it real. How do we make this subject real? I mean, when we're talking about things that are so tiny, they're like a speck of dust, how do we communicate that to employees? So you got to start somewhere where you can find something familiar in your day-to-day as a starting point. Now, a lot of you have probably seen this image. This got really, really popular during the coronavirus pandemic because everybody was trying to like wrap their mind around what this actually was, how big it was, those types of things. It could be like sunlight when explaining UV radiation, gravel pits when talking about silica inhalation, you know, something like that where you can say, okay, yeah, it's this tiny particle, but it's actually something that you can relate to something that's bigger in the world. So why does this matter? Just talking about compliance really doesn't motivate us to change as much as we would like. It rarely results in lasting behavioral change, but when we know better and we know the what and the why, we do a lot better. We just need to know why we need to do better. So if you can find a way to illustrate that will capture the imagination, it's going to really help you relate to employees because so many of us are those visual and hands-on learners. So I'm going to show you an example of this. We're going to talk a little bit about confined spaces. So, you know, when we work in confined spaces, I'm always trying to get people to make sure they sample all different layers of air. So let's look at why they actually need to do that. And sometimes, you know, you're working with people who have a great understanding of this, and sometimes you're not. So this could be a simple illustration, but it could kind of make things click. So let's see.
When you're testing gases in a confined space, you always want to test all levels of the confined space because some gases are heavier than air, while others are lighter than air. But this will make more sense when I show you what I mean. This is how a gas that's heavier than air will react in a confined space. Now let's see how a gas that's lighter than air will react in a confined space. Are you ready? And that's why we test the air at all levels of a confined space.
Okay, so again, this is nothing groundbreaking here. We all know that, helium balloons are going to float. So it's just using something that we're already familiar with that's like, oh, I get it. Okay, yeah, that's why we need to test different levels. So start with somewhere simple and go from there. If you can find a way to illustrate it, giving that sort of image is so much better than just telling. So showing is always better than telling. So follow-up. Now, this is a key part that's often overlooked. Lack of follow-up often results in suspicion. So remember to really do that communication. Make sure employees know the state of exposures in their workplaces and what's being done to maintain safe conditions. So that's kind of where I want to go ahead and move to this next one. Of the discussion points that we talked about, what do you think you will be able to take from here to implement into your own IH sampling or into relating IH information to employees that's useful to you? I'm really interested to hear because I can expand on those in future presentations and make it more valuable and continue to just create more learning and more understanding. So let me know which one of these. We talked about basic IH information, resources listed. Some of us just need a few resources to get started. Examples for communicating where we showed some of the good versus the bad, or sort of video demonstrations. Obviously, at a lot of workplaces, you're going to be doing in-person demonstrations, which is awesome. So just let me know what would be the most useful to you. Okay, in 3, 2, 1. Okay, examples for communicating. Cool. That's actually like won by quite a lot. So that's awesome. I actually didn't know that would be the most interesting part, but we can definitely go into more detail on that and focus on it as well. So thank you so much for that information. So with that, we have covered our 2 main topics of IH basics and also how to relate that sort of information to people. So if you're ready, Michelle, we could go ahead and open it up to the Q&A.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for that great presentation as well. We have a ton of questions coming in, so let's get right to them. First question here is, do you mind just clarifying a little bit on the 5-day notification? So this person thought it was originally 10 days. So did they switch it to 5 days?
No, they have not. And it does vary from substances too. So what I would say is make sure that you check for that particular substance. And that 5 days is after receipt of information. So that was for some specifics. I can't remember exactly what it was off the top of my head. So you may not be incorrect. We may just be talking about different topics.
Great. Thank you so much. And do you mind explaining the difference between an 8-hour sample and a short-term sample?
Yeah, absolutely. So 8-hour samples are nice because they can show you what somebody's exposed to over a whole day. It also takes a little bit less calculation. What I would say is when you're doing short-term samples, it's usually for a specific process or something specific that's going on through the day. It's not for something that an employee may be doing for 8 hours. So what you're going to be looking at is what's that short-term exposure. So you're looking at, okay, let's say this person does abrasive blasting for an hour and a half a day, and the rest of their day is like cleaning up the shop. You're not going to need to know their exposure throughout the entire day because it's not really going to apply. So you want to know exactly what they're exposed to during that abrasive blasting. And then you can kind of see, okay, is this below the permissible exposure limit? Where 8 hours is if you're doing the same thing for an entire day. So let's say you are working with some carpenters in an area that may have some asbestos fibers in the air, then your 8-hour sample will be more representative of their total exposure.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I know we're getting a little bit close to the top of the hour here, so we'll try to fit in a few more questions. This next question is, as a non-certified IH, I was always told that it would not be beneficial to take any measurements because it doesn't hold up in court. How does one decide what to measure and when to bring it in?
Okay, so I know that there are some similar statements that I've heard out there about that. I would also say in industry, I see a lot of IH techs. Like I used to be an IH tech working for a large consulting firm, and they have you sampling pretty much constantly. So it kind of depends. If you're under the direction of an IH, that can help. I would also say, like for most companies, not being the option of not having samples taken versus having them taken is always better. I don't know of any legislation that says you have to have a CIH in order to sample. So I don't think that that's necessarily compelling. But from what I know of people who have been in court kind of defending their decisions in sampling, they will pick out anything they can to kind of come after your level of expertise. So I would say it could be a million different things. If you dated a sample wrong, they could come after that. So yeah. So
right,
I guess sorry, I'll try to summarize that really quick. You are not prohibited from sampling. In court, they will try to get you for a lot of different things if you have to justify why you did what you did. It's better to sample than not to sample, but just make sure if you can that you get an IH to kind of oversee it, and that will help you out.
Thank you. All right, we're going to close out with this last question here. If most of our chemicals are used within ventilated fume hoods, is it still a good practice to perform exposure monitoring?
Yes, I would, to confirm that things are working as they should. You always want to make sure, especially with hoods, that they are, the ventilation is working and it's correct for the particle size that you have and all of those types of things. And the only really simple way to confirm that for me is usually to do sampling. Not knowing exactly what chemicals you're working with, I don't want to speak too soon, but I would say, yeah, that's what you want to do, is make sure that you have those records. That's going to cover you for liability as well. So it's just better to have that data recorded for your own knowledge.
All right. Thank you so much. Any final comments on your end before we close out for the afternoon?
Not for me. I would just say thank you all for being here. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for entering your information in the polling questions. It's always super interesting for me to hear where you're coming from, what you're dealing with at work, and then also to see what your thoughts are on the presentation so that I can continue to improve. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Wonderful, Rachel. Thank you so much for your time as well. We really appreciate you sharing that content with us. A great presentation. And just to reiterate what she said, thank you all again for attending this session as well. We appreciate your participation. And a huge thank you to our two webinar sponsors, Intelex and Avetta, for making this session possible. If you missed any part of today's session, it was recorded, so if you had to step away, or like I said, if you just want to rewatch it again, you will receive a copy of today's recording via email in about 24 hours, coming from the EHS Daily Advisor. So keep an eye out for that. It sometimes can land in your junk or your spam folder, so make sure you check there as well. And one more time, Rachel, thank you. Thank you each in the audience, and a huge thanks to Intelex and Avetta. I hope you're all enjoying the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.